All right, today is Tuesday, 19th October, and when we last met last week, we were finishing off Lot 35. My goal today is to finish off Lot 36. A lot of the seems like a lot of questions are repeated in this particular module. So you all gonna copy these handouts. Sometimes, well, let's start off with clearing up from last week. Anybody have any issues with any questions off of Lot 35? We all good? All right. So, I did not go into detail like I often do. The Kitty Genovese case, which is mentioned in Lot 35. It's a classic case. It's a really old case from 1964. And basically, the case involves a woman who was running a bar, got off of work sometime after 2 in the morning, and parked her car and was walking back to her apartment. And she was brutally attacked, stabbed, and she was screaming like a banshee. And then this is in New York City, and like a lot of cities, the property lines are very close. So there's a lot of apartments, skyscrapers where people live, and so a lot of people heard her screaming, even through closed windows. Some actually opened the window and looked out to see what was going on, and it didn't take a millisecond to see this is not a couple of drunk people couldn't wait to get home to have sex, so they're doing it in the street. Nobody's got that blood-curdling scream unless they're being assaulted, and she was. And the guy, for whatever reason, somebody yelled out the window, "Leave that girl alone." And I think he thought, uh-oh, I'm going to get in trouble. So he left, but he didn't go very far. He parked his car around the corner, so he went back to his car, and he sort of listened for the sirens. No sirens. So he went back where she was, and she had gotten up and was moving closer to her apartment. Obviously, she was trying to get home safely. And he commenced to start stabbing her again and trying to sexually assault her. And of course, she died. And the New York Times, which of course is then, as it is now, a big newspaper, started the series on her because when the police went and investigated. I don't remember exactly how many people were involved, but it was like 36 people had heard or actually seen what was going on, and nobody called 911. Of course, they didn't have 911 then, which was the tie-in. Because of her death, and because of the fact that if somebody wanted to call the police, just like here in this campus, you have to call the 831 2000 number, whatever, and you can get the police. But if you don't know that number, and of course that's 7 digits, a lot more difficult than just dialing 911. So they did this like 7, 8 page, I mean not page, but series of articles about this in the New York Times, which of course is internationally uh, purchased, published, and sent to different parts of the world. So it made the United States look horrible that we would have over 30 people hear or see somebody getting violently stabbed and raped or attempted rape, and nobody called the police. And it talks about, I think this one talks about, there was at least one guy who wanted to call the police, but he didn't know whether he should or not. So he calls his friend and says, hey, there's a woman getting stabbed and raped out here. Should I call the police? No, don't get involved. This is a guy who lives 12 floors up. Ooh, don't get involved. This is a guy going to see your little bitty face. Oh, I'm going to remember you and come after you. Crazy. Crazy. So, it was on the front page of the largest distributed newspaper in the world for a long time. And it really made us as Americans look like we were careless, heartless animals, I guess. Well, Kitty had a brother who got wounded in Vietnam next to a wheelchair. And this ties into some of the stuff that we talked about with the Milgram experiment, with the shopping machine, and the Stanford Prison Project with putting people in roles of prisoners and corrections officers. Because of this case, it created within psychology a phenomenon called the bystander effect, or Benavisi syndrome. And what it meant from a social psychology point of view is, because after this, people really researched the crap out of this, because they found that just like with Milgram and Stanford case, people couldn't believe that people would actually do what they would do. You remember with the Milgram case, he consulted with the psychiatry staff at Yale as to how many people, what percentage of people would go all the way to 400 watts, shocking the crap out of somebody while they're behind the wall. They could hear them screaming, I got a heart condition. And the psychiatrist told them less than 0.5% of people, because it would take somebody who's sadistically have a personality that would, in essence, wouldn't bother them. Not only wouldn't bother them, but they would kind of take pleasure out of shocking the crap out of somebody. Well, of course, that's total crap, as you now know. So that's the argument they were making here. And there is some truth to the bystander effect. So this is important to you as a person because you might be one of those bystanders, or and if you're one of the victims. This is the reality of the situation. The larger the crowd that's involved as spectators, the less likely somebody's going to call 911. And you're all sitting there thinking, what the hell is that? You think more people, there'd be a greater chance somebody, all they have to do is, everybody in the world's got it. It's this side of the world. It's got a cell phone. How tough is it to dial 911? Well, it is a psychological phenomenon that people tend to get frozen in time, and it incapacitates them. If somebody is laying on the ground with blood flowing out of them, it's like a temporary PTSD where people just freak out and they end up doing nothing. If there was only 2 people there, it's more likely that somebody would do something. But if there's 8, it's very or more, it's very likely nobody will do anything. Now you could say, well, if you're that 9th person that rolls up on the scene, you might say, well, hell, there's 8 people here. They were here before I was. Certainly somebody has called 911, but nobody checks it out. 9, 10. So, oh, man, there's no poor girl. Well, I will remember this for the rest of my life. When I was in military boot camp, everybody takes a first aid class. And the very first day of first aid class, the instructor was talking about what you do when you come out upon a wounded person or an unconscious person. And he says, this is a good lesson for you to remember. He says, you go in and you're going to take charge, but before you do that, the first thing you do is look at the crowd of people who are assembled, and you look at somebody and you point to them. You go, call 911, call the cops. You point at them, you look at them right in the eye, and you tell them. Because if you just begin to work or try to put compress on some kind of bleeding thing, and, hey, somebody call 911. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. The moment you point, and if this guy is still frozen, then you find another person. And you don't start working on the patient until somebody acknowledges that you can see they're pulling their phone out. Then you can go work on the situation. And you think that's crazy, but it's not. It's not. So, 1964, now that's it, yes. Yes. Almost. Years ago. Today is the 19th. So that would make the 18th yesterday, correct? A homeless man charged with raping a woman on a commuter train outside Philadelphia claims the encounter was consensual. Fiston Nagoy, 35, has been charged with rape in Wednesday's attack aboard a southeastern Pennsylvania transportation authority. Nagoy insisted the encounter with the woman who he told cops was drunk, was alone at the time, and it had been consensual. But she said the version of events was false, telling investigators this moron ignored her pleas for him to go away. Surveillance footage inside the Sept train backed up the woman's account, showing Nagoy spending nearly 45 minutes touching and groping her prior to 10 p.m. Here's our glorious perpetrator. Piston told police he recognized the woman and tried to strike up a conversation. Police arrest him and list his address as a shelter, homeless shelter in Philadelphia. An off-duty transit officer who witnessed the assault called an emergency line, but no one aboard the westbound train on the Market Frankford line stepped in to stop the attack. It remained unclear Monday exactly how many passengers were in the car at the time, but Upper Darby Police Superintendent Bernhardt said the attack may have been prevented if somebody got involved. Piston had been charged with rape and attack aboard this thing. Okay, we got it. There was a lot of people, in my opinion, that should have intervened. Somebody should have done something, Bernhardt said. It speaks to where we are in a society who will allow such a thing to take place. It is so troubling. Bernhardt said that the woman was unbelievably strong, told cops she remembered getting on the train at 9:15. She couldn't recall anything after that until cops pulled her attacker off of her. Now you know about memory. Now you know about emotion. She is already suffering PTSD and can't even remember all the steps after 40 minutes of sexual assault. She can't remember. And it's unlikely she is going to remember it because, as you know, the window of opportunity for that memory reconsolidation is gone. Doesn't mean she couldn't be given a propranolol pill after they revived the error that she was going through with different pills. So she could not be so afraid. Throughout the time, this victim is obviously struggling and trying to keep him off of her. He tried saying the word, but she sticks together so much. This one doesn't talk about a number of people who pulled out their cell phone to call 911. People got their cell phone to video it, and then went home and posted on whatever media thing there. Now, another article, there's several of them, you should look it up in the chat. The prosecutor is talking about prosecuting the witnesses who didn't do it. And that's always a tricky issue. It depends on what the state law is, on whether you have a duty to report a crime or not. Most states, there is not a law that says you have a duty to report. You can ignore right away. Those of you who might be going into the medical profession, I think, something to do about your ethics. It says you cannot ignore a victim, like a car crash or something. When I was dating a student nurse back in the day, we were driving, and some guy rear-ended this guy who was stopped at a light, and this guy just rear-ended completely, didn't stop. So, yes, we called 911. And she insisted on getting out and doing an assessment on the guy. So, two guys. The guy was driving the car that got hit, and the guy was driving the car. And basically, what happened was the guy had a seizure. And about I had a student in one of my introduction to psychology classes was prone seizures, and she took medicine. She would still have them, and even though she would get a little bit of warning beforehand that one was coming on, a lot of times when she felt it coming on, she was driving, she immediately pulled off the shoulder, and then she would go and sleep. And after the seizure is over, you're a little groggy because even though you know you're from the seizures, it takes you a little while to get back to earth. And she has been stopped several times, been encountered with police officers who immediately jump to the wrong conclusion that she's doing drugs or something like that. Very, very upsetting situation when your fellow citizens, and I'm not talking about going in and intervening. This is the guy who looks like he might be pretty big. I was looking for a picture of him next to somebody to see how big he is. He's not a small guy. So maybe people did not physically intervene because the guy could have had a knife, could have had a gun. Every once in a while you read about some bystander intervening and getting shot or killed, stabbed, which is not a good thing. Not to mention, in our litigious society, if I decide to intervene, which I would, and I did some kind of maneuver that was potentially harmful, maybe the guy ends up being killed, and then his family sued me because I was trying to put a neck restraint on him to cut off his aortic blood to his head. You do it correctly. I'm not an MMA expert, but it's one of the things you learn. You do it correctly, you can cut off their brain, the blood to their brain, and they will pass out. And as soon as you release it, the blood will start flowing and they'll come back. But if you put it on the arm, you'll asphyxiate. You'll cut their air off. And once you do that, their air is not coming back. They're gone. Unless somebody manually brings them back. So it's all about where you put this part of your arm. Put that over the windpipe, then you're not going to crush it. But if you grab somebody and you choke in this way, they're probably going to affect their windpipe and kill them. So the big difference as to, unless you're no combatants because of military or police training or MMA training, you might make a mistake. And if you're worried about being sued, that's not an imaginary concern. Still doesn't answer the reason why you have enough time to pull it out and video it, but not enough time to dial 911. It's sad state of affairs. There was another case which I didn't think where I'll just tell you what happened. A woman was in a bar and there was at least one pool table in the bar, and some guy started sexually assaulting her. And everybody in the bar just sort of backed up and watched, and with some members going, "Do it, get her! Go, let's go, Brandon!" You know. But the prosecutor in that case went after the spectators, and I can't remember what state it was. There was some duty to to report. I don't, actually, I haven't looked at the text law to see what the requirement is. There is a Good Samaritan law in many states where if you are trying to help somebody, whether because they're bleeding or not breathing or stabbed or getting raped or something, and your intervention actually makes things worse, that people can sue you for that. For instance, anybody who's in a car accident, and they, especially if they've been hit by behind, they may have a neck or spinal injury. And you do not want to be moving that person if they're inside the car smashed up and you're trying to pull them out of the car and lay them down on the ground. That is not a good thing to do because you could make things worse and you could actually threaten their life if they have spinal injury. So when the paramedics get there, they assess that, they put a neck brace on, they do all sorts of things to stop that from happening. If the car is on fire, well, yeah, you got to get them out regardless of whether they've got a neck injury or not. Because if you don't, they're going to get burned to death, so they're going to die. But there are laws that protect Good Samaritan people who are trying to help fellow citizens. And I had an occasion to do that one time, and it was very eventful for me because I was with my girlfriend, who's now a doctor. Believe it or not, she saw a little piece of plastic on the side of the road. It was in Illinois. It was very dark. We were out in a rural area. And she said, stop, I think there's been an accident. I'm thinking, you freaking crazy. No car. So then just follow. Never have said. So I flipped to you, got out of the car, I saw a piece of plastic, looking around, what did I see? Car tracks through the grass. So I followed it, and I got about halfway. I never did see the car. Well, actually, I did see the car, but not before I saw the guy. And the guy's coming back, right? I think, oh, good, the guy's not bleeding, he's walking. And I said something really intelligent, like, hey, dude, what's happening? Well, I completely done. I grabbed him and stopped. Dude, you have an accident? He's in shock. This is a common symptom of shock. They have no awareness, whatever. My concern was somebody else is in the car and hurt and can't get out and walk. Well, as it turned out, he was the only one. But it's a good example because when somebody is under the trauma of an accident or an injury, if they're in shock, they are not thinking and they're not going to have a conversation. If you watch TV or actually have seen this kind of stuff, you'll see the paramedics always asking the guy, hey, dude, what's your name? You know, we got you. What's up? You know, they're trying to get them back into consciousness so they can tell them, you know, where does it hurt? They can see blood coming out or whatever. It's not an easy job being a frontline law enforcement or EMT. It's not easy, but I would hope. I remember that from basic training was a long time ago, and I always think of that. If I see, the first thing I'm going to do is ask people who are suffering from mental illness. And I've never had that situation occur, but it's ingrained in my brain to do that. All right, so let's go to Questions on 536. I think these, I'm not trying to insult anybody, I think these questions and answers are pretty straightforward, right out of the book. Really, I'll ask you, any of you have questions about these questions and uncertain about whether your answer is correct or not? Remember, when you start thinking about the exam questions, you got that question? Remember, when it comes to exam questions, questions like number 1, which is the definition of prejudice, quick test question. I'm sure we got a definition of stereotypes in here. Number 8 is the definition of discrimination. Now, I have a question for you, number 13. Edward claims that he is not prejudiced against members of other sexes, of other races. However, on a bus, he never sits next to anyone of a different race, and in class, he never works on a project with members of a different race. This type of subtle prejudice illustrates what? Are you going to answer for that one? Answer mine. Surprise. Authors of this text. They call that a microaggression. It's not scapegoating, it's not hindsight bias, it's not stereotyping. So it's microaggression. That's not at all what I would label as a microaggression. Because I don't see there's any aggression at all. So you might call it a micro discriminatory act. 15 talks about implicit prejudice. You remember from our discussions about memory that implicit memories occur naturally, unconsciously. So, studies of implicit prejudice indicate that prejudice is often an unconscious state. So, where did we learn prejudice? It's not a conscious thing. Well, we learned it from our implicit memories, social learning. You remember, well, maybe you don't remember, it was a while back when Obama was president, and I don't know how somebody got a question like this today, but the question was something about what should a person do if they're walking down the street by themselves and 3 black males are walking behind them. You know, is that the kind of prejudice you're talking about, Mr. President? And surprisingly, he said, if I was walking down the street and there were 3 black males walking behind me, I would cross over to the other side of the street. I don't know if you guys remember that, but he did say that. So number 16 talks about prejudice can not only be subtle, but also automatic. That's implicit association. And then there's actually a test somebody created, some social psychologists, called the implicit association test, which is in number 17. Let's look at number 19. grading the performance of a minority group member by using lower standards and a patronizing attitude is called unconscious patronization. Now, I forgot to give you the article, so I'll just mention it to you. There was a guy, a professor in California, who was in the tenure track to become a tenured faculty. And he happened to be white, and he had a black student who asked him if he could, if the professor would delay the test for, I don't know, a week or something, because of the George Floyd incident. And as a black male, he was really upset about the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And he wanted a special accommodation because he was upset with that. And the professor told him, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he complained to the administration, and the administration told him he should do an accommodation for him. And the instructor said, you're crazy. Am I going to adjust my testing and my grading for situational events that happens in my student life? I mean, this guy doesn't know anybody. Nobody got hurt that he knows. It wasn't a family member having died from a heart attack or something or a car accident. I think all of us who are professors make accommodations for people's lives because we understand there is life outside this classroom. Number 20, one study, white university women assess flawed students' essays. Their evaluations of essays supposedly written by white students were low, often with harsh comments. They gave high evaluations to essays that were said to have been written by black students. The women's evaluations were influenced by unconscious patronization. That's interesting, since we talked about stereotype threat and the fact that I could hand you out a 10-page scientific paper written by Dr. Johnson, and half of them said Dr. Barry Johnson, and the other one said Dr. Mark Johnson. Since you didn't know anything about the subject, I asked you to rate it from 0 being dumber than a box of rocks to 10 being brilliant. And what happens? Women grade the men higher, the Mark Johnson higher, and of course males grade the Mark Johnson paper higher. And we discussed why does that happen? It has to do with stereotypes and learning. Got one neuroscience question in here, and it's 21. Neuroscience scientists have detected implicit prejudice, the kind that's not conscious, in an emotional processing center known as the amygdala. The amygdala is part of the system that we talked about. It regulates your emotions. And indeed, the amygdala is what has to do with a lot of things that has to do with emotions and aggressivity. Okay. Number 25 talks about racial attitudes have changed dramatically in the last half century. Barely 50, 60 years ago, it was against the law for interracial marriages to occur. It seems amazing that a black and a white person get married in a lot of states in the 60s. Another great social psychology experiment. Number 28, an observation of more than 800 billion internet words have found what? D, a greater association of pleasant words, adjectives, with European American names compared with what people would consider African American names. Is Jones an African American name, or is it a European American name? Some people's names in the African American community were derived from their ancestors who were slaves, and they did not have last names, so they took the last name of their slave owner. A lot of Joneses are white, a lot of Joneses are white. I don't know how. Today's, when I looked at this guy's name here, Fiston, Fiston, Ngoy, Ngoy. I thought maybe he was big league because in the Vietnamese language, and is often not, but sometimes used for a name like Nguyen, which doesn't look like Nguyen, but it looks like Nguyen, Ngyn, that's pronounced Nguyen, but it has an N in front of it. I would have missed that one. This guy is clearly not. 31. Which of the following is an example of gender prejudice? Dr. Johnson. Answer would be B. Rebecca, who was 16, thinks her mother is less intelligent than her. All right, since this is your study guide, you explain to me what the answer is to 33. Because I know what the book answer is, and it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Anybody get that question? A shortage of women has been attributed to an increase in all of the following except shortage of women. What's that? Less females in the population than males? That one you can bet is not on the exam. The answer the book gives is drug trafficking. That makes no sense to me at all. So don't worry about that. Number 36 is what we talked about homosexuality. Which of the following is not true about states with anti-gay prejudice is high? The suicide rate of anti-gay or gay people is the same as heterosexual. Wrong. If LGBTQ people live in an area where their choices are looked upon very negatively and stereotyped, their suicide rate is elevated for obvious reasons. I can tell you my experience when I was looking at 38 here. Jack is a transgender man. Where is he likely to experience harassment? The answer, at school and at work. I can tell you my experience being at the school about 10 years. I mean, students don't generally announce that they're transgender, so you have to sometimes make assumptions. But I have had students who are, I don't know what to say. Let me put it differently. I've had students who tell me, because I usually go through the alphabet and make sure I can say everybody's first name correctly, because I think that's important. But I generally also say, like if your name is Roberto or something, you might have a nickname or something. So if you like to be called something else, some guys have the same name as their father, and so therefore they're not called that at home, they're called by their middle name. So I always ask, you can ask, do you have a nickname, or do you prefer to be called something else? Some people say it doesn't matter. You can call me Rod, you can call me Bob, you can call me Bobby, you can call me Robert, you can call me Roberto, it's not important. Okay? Beto. I had a woman in class who dressed very manly, had very manly masculine haircut. And let's say her name was Caroline. So I asked her, do you have a preference? And she said, yes. You should call me Steve. I said, sure. So clearly, in my mind, she wanted to identify as a man. She dressed like a man, she had a haircut like a man, and she wants a man's name. Transgender, I don't, it doesn't make any difference. My point is, nobody seemed to have a problem with that in class, which is good. Which is good. So, I'm not denying that prejudice doesn't occur on this campus, but it may. 39, which of the following people most likely to experience open discrimination, which means right to your face? Answer, Carol, who is a Muslim. I don't know. Most people can't look at somebody and figure out what religion that is. Number 40. What is the just world phenomenon? It's called several different things. Just world phenomenon. What it means is, it's like karma. People get something that they have earned because of their behavior. So the just world phenomenon means if something bad happens to you because you were doing something bad, then you deserve that because you were doing something bad. In the legal system, we say, if you do the crime, you got to do the time. Other people say it's just deserves. Deserve. What does deserve have to do with it? It's a saying that means, look, If you're going to act this way, this is what this is how you're going to be treated. And it's only fair. If you eat a nice meal, you get a nice dessert. Mess up things and you don't get a nice dessert. But until I used this book, I never heard anybody call anything a just world. But I have heard lots of times people say, well, they're getting their just desserts. Meaning, you do a crime, you're going to do the time. Or if you're being pushy or aggressive or something, one of these days somebody's going to knock you out. Because you may be bigger than a lot of people, but you're not bigger than everybody. And it's not a size issue. If you need a good lesson in that, go YouTube Bruce Lee. Scrawny little guy. Sure, he was muscular, didn't have big muscles. He was muscular, didn't have big muscles. He's certainly not a big guy. He could do a lot of damage to somebody, no matter what size they were, because he was a very skilled fighter. Pretty cruel. Look at 42. People who blame victims of cancer for their medical misfortune best illustrate the just world phenomenon. Oh, go on the side, smoke cigarettes. You're the one who was drinking like a fish, and now you've got cirrhosis of the liver. 43. Stan believes that wealthy people deserve to be robbed because of their ill-gotten gains. This best illustrates a potential consequence of just you make an assumption, first of all, that somebody earned that money using an ill-gotten method. There are some people in the United States, by the way, you may read this, Portland, Oregon, remember Portland, Oregon, all the burning and shooting and looting and taking over part of the city, and the stupid mayor saying, oh, you can have this part of the city. We'll have a summer fun, outdoor festival. Well, that's right. That percent of people that's Antifa or BLM, whoever it is, started burning the city down again, and the cops did not intervene because the mayor and the council has taken away their mace, taken away their pepper spray, taken away their tasers, taken away their rubber bullets, and told them they can't use them, so they don't have them available to them. So, not to mention the fact, if you use a nightstick or expandable mask to whack somebody who was about to throw a Molotov cocktail through a window, those people were being reprimanded. Some of them were being discharged. Some of them were being sued successfully. So the police force just sat back and watched what happened. $1 million worth of buildings, offices get destroyed last night. Probably recognize in-group bias, out-group bias. That's not a hard concept. Always a lot of Canada is all in-group bias. 61 is an issue. I mentioned it before when we talked about memory. Now it comes back again. The tendencies to recall faces of one's own race more accurately than faces of others is called the other race effect. Is that prejudicial? Is that somebody who's carrying a prejudice? No, it is not. Look into the neurology, development of children, infants under the age of 1. Well, first of all, when you're born, you are innately programmed in your brain to pay attention to faces. It's a survival mechanism. If you're part of your learning, who is in your social sphere that you know. Many of you have been around kids that age. There comes a time where anybody can stick their face in the crib or in the cart that you're pushing the kid in, stroller, and kids love it. They see a face, they light up to it. They don't care what age, what color, nothing. They do not literally discriminate on faces. But as they get older, they learn to discriminate who are the faces that I see the most of. My mom, my dad, brothers and sisters, uncles, whoever has a constant opportunity to see their face, they focus on them. And at the exclusion of others. So if your cousin who doesn't live in your town comes and visits the kid is going to start waiting. Because even though it's a family member, it's somebody that they don't see very often, maybe never seen. So it's a stranger, so they start waiting. So by discrimination, I mean figuring out the faces in your world, who are the people I see most often, and I'm comfortable around those people. If I see a face of somebody else, then I'm going to start wailing. And that does happen. Your neural pathways are, and your synaptic pruning is going on to focus on people that are known to you. Probably a survival characteristic as well. And then later on, it doesn't matter. Still kids sort of hesitate in the presence of a stranger for a while, but they're not into wailing and crying when they were younger. So the reason that eyewitnesses are so poor at describing what somebody looked like that's another race than their own is because they may not frequent with somebody from that race. And people are always making generalizations. All black people look the same, all Asians look the same. You don't hear too much about all whites look the same, unless you're in a different part of the world where there's not very many whites. Then to them, white people look the same because you don't have much experience with somebody of a different race. So that is not because you are internally prejudiced, it's because you don't have much experience with. All right. Pay attention to this one. 71. Dan is wealthy and his peers are aware of this fact. They are more likely to view Dan as intelligent. Number 74 has to do with the introduction of alcohol into your system, and sometimes that makes people less inhibited. Their prefrontal cortex up here is making decisions. I was talking about the amygdala and the limbic system, which is several parts of the brain. I think I did a handout on that when we were talking about it. Your brain makes assessments as to whether somebody looks aggressive to you or they look friendly to you or whatever, and then you're going to respond accordingly. Number 75. The fact that human aggression varies widely from culture to culture most strongly suggests that it is not seen, an unlearned instinct. However, that we look at biopsychosocial, and we're specifically talking about social. Very simple. If you grow up in a house where domestic violence occurred, you are more likely to be an aggressor of domestic violence when you have your own home. Because it's social learning, you grew up with it, and you repeat it in your home. Now, there's a lot of literature, especially in forensic psychology, discipline within psychology, that says there are anatomy issues that you can look at which predispose you to act aggressively. I think, well, the very next page, Mayo, MAOA gene, they call it the warrior gene. Well, guess what? Authors should be a little bit smarter than this. There's about 12 or 14 gene combinations which are part of the warrior gene family. So your genes can affect whether you are prone to be aggressive or not. And that has to do with your limbic system and your expression of your warrior genes that you have. I don't know whether we'll have time this semester to talk about forensic psychology at the very end. Hopefully we will. And we'll learn a little bit more about this. Monoamine oxidase A, MAO A gene, sometimes called, couldn't say, one of the warrior genes, helps break down transmitters such as neurotransmitters such as dopamine. Some people who are violent, drugs that we get prescribed with words MAO. The authors also want to tie in testosterone, which is found in both men and women, by the way. and it does have different effects on people. Testosterone has a huge effect on your sex drive, your sex interest in males and females. And one of the differences between males and females as a gender issue is as a group, men are more aggressive than women. Here's a good suggestion, number 98. Did you get 98 or like a little too far, right? I thought I did. I didn't remember that number. Anyway, 98 talks about positively reinforcing, especially with your sons, when they do socially acceptable behavior. And I may have used one time in this class, if you were like second grade class or something, first grade class, rather than you as a parent or as a teacher, rather than focus on negative, that if you focus on somebody who's doing the right thing, not only are you rewarding the person who's doing the right thing, but you're sending a message to all the other students in the class. This is what the instructor wants me to do. It's 5 minutes till noon. We're about to go eat lunch. And Susie over here is sitting very nicely with her hands together on her lap. Great job, Susie. You might be the line leader today. So anybody else who's interested in being a line leader or whatever, lucky the kids want to follow along and get some attention from their teacher or parent, at least for a while, before they change. But always best to focus on the positive when you can. And kids will learn that because they like to be treated nicely and they like to be the line leader. If I'm in the behavioral modification, I carry little treats in my bag or in my hand that I can go around and say, oh, you're really working hard on your class assignment. Here's a couple of cookies. Oh, you don't like cookies? All right, well, that's the mod 34, mod 35, final mod 36, Thursday. Always, if you have any questions on any of the study guides, it's free to shoot me an email or text. Anybody missing any tests in here? Forgot to take it or gone or something? Look on Blackboard, make sure you've taken all the tests. You should have a grade for all of them. If not, we can do something about making it up. Okay? See you on Thursday.
Do you have anyone?